Hi, everybody. This is Coffee with Cornelius, and I'm your host, Cornelius Christian. What you're about to see is a previously unaired interview I did with Charles Burton a couple of months back about Canada China relations, a topic that is very salient now given the news that China has charged two Canadians with espionage. And these allegations, of course, are probably unsubstantiated, knowing the CCP, knowing the Chinese Communist Party. But Charles Burton is my colleague at Brock University. I'm very proud to say that. He's a great scholar of China and somebody I think the Canadian government needs to listen to more closely when it comes to dealing with the CCP. So I hope you enjoy this interview. And if you enjoy this content, like and subscribe if you want to see more. I am pleased to be here with my colleague, Dr. Charles Burton, an expert on China-Canada relations. Today, we are talking about whether China is an existential danger to Canada, specifically, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP's penetration into Canadian politics, academia, journalism, and Beijing's cover-up of the spread of COVID-19 and how that's affected Canadian policymaking towards the virus. Dr. Burton has a bachelor's and a PhD from the University of Toronto and also studied at the University of Cambridge. He also studied the history of ancient Chinese thought at Fudan University in Shanghai. He is currently a professor at Brock University. As I mentioned, he's my colleague and previously worked at the Department of National Defense in Ottawa and served as a counselor to Canada's embassy in China. Dr. Burton is a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute in Ottawa, as well as the European Values Center for Security Policy in Prague. It is an honor to have you on our show. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Burton, you were a diplomat to China, and based on your background and experience, you seem to have a deep love for Chinese culture and language. Currently, you are critical of Ottawa's relationship with Beijing. How did your views on China-Canada relations evolve over your career?
Well, Cornelius, I go back a long way with Canada-China relations. I became interested in the subject when I was a high school student. And on the walk home from my high school, Lister Collegiate Institute in Ottawa, there was a bookstore called Progressive Books, which was sponsored by the government of China, although at that time we still didn't have an embassy here. We didn't have relations. So I started to read a lot of materials out of China when I was a teenager, Peking Review and Chinese literature and so on, and developed a strong interest in that culture. And then I decided to study Chinese philosophy at university, Trinity College, Toronto. And then I went to Pembroke College, Cambridge, where I went into Oriental studies and learned the Chinese language with a view to studying ancient Chinese thought. And then I transferred to Fudan University in Shanghai, where I was in the class of 77 there during a very difficult political period. Well, I was different from some of the other foreign students in China at that time. There weren't very many of us. And in those days at Fudan University, there were 13 foreign students, all on official exchange programs. I wasn't a sympathizer with the Cultural Revolution and the Mao ideology, but I was interested in contemporary Chinese politics and the contrast in terms of development model of China with other nations and the commitment of the regime to social justice and fair allocation of resources and developing the literacy of farmers and so on. So, I was in general involved in that, and I certainly supported the Canadian establishment of diplomatic relations with China in 1970, and our subsequent setting up an embassy there, establishing a CETA program, and trying to support the Chinese regime in its development and bringing China into the global community as a player and supporting China's development of its economy to alleviate poverty there. But I wasn't supportive of the repressive policies of the Cultural Revolution, like censorship and the detention of dissident intellectuals and so on, which was common at that time. And I think because I did live in China in that period, just as the revolutionary era was ending and just before China established the opening and reform policies and abandoned the Marxist ideology as a guide to policy, I met a lot of intellectuals who had been persecuted in the Cultural Revolution. And this caused me to have less and less good feelings about the ideological basis of that regime. Subsequently, when I started to work in the embassy, my first posting was just after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, and a lot of our work was involved in trying to reestablish programming with China. Then my second posting occurred at the end of the 1990s, and in that posting I was a political officer, and my mandate was the promotion of democratic norms. The Canadian government had programs called Good Governance, Democratic Development, and Human Rights. Canada invested over a long period, maybe 15 years, we invested over $1 billion of Canadian taxpayer money into the democratic development, good governance, and human rights programming. And I became responsible for a civil society program, a program designed to create a civil space in China that would give people in China a sense of citizenship identification and hopefully lead to their demanding their entitlements to human rights from the government. But we also had other programs, such as we built a building in the Beijing Normal University for senior judges training, and had a large-scale exchange program with the University of Montreal to train Chinese judges in international norms of governance. And at the time, China signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of the UN, one of the covenants that, initial covenant growing out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So there was a lot of optimism about this programming. After I left government service, returned to Brock, I was given a contract by the Canadian Foreign Ministry to do an assessment of the bilateral human rights dialogue that we had. We had a secret, well, at least the contents was not revealed, a secret program of engagement with Chinese government departments on human rights. And I was the Canadian, I think, who participated in more of these yearly dialogues than any other between the period 1998 and 2005. Anyway, I was asked to write an assessment of the human rights dialogue, and under the assistance from the embassy, I went to try and establish what sort of progress this activity that the Canadian government was funding fairly generously was making. And I wrote a report about it that received quite a lot of international attention. I know this partially because when the WikiLeaks came out, one of the cables from the U.S. State Department discussed an activity that they had where they went around to all of the governments that had bilateral human rights dialogues and asked them for their assessment of the findings of my report. So I think that report was probably a critical moment for me when I realized that, the current Chinese communist regime was not amenable to reform from within. And the idea that we could see a democratization of China from above was just not possible under the existing Leninist framework. And so then I as you say, I began to become quite active in attempting to bring the Canada and other Western nations round to the idea that we had to engage China in a more realistic fashion, acknowledging that the Chinese commitments to coming into compliance with international norms of human rights, or for that matter, international norms of diplomacy and trade, were not sincere. They were simply designed to manipulate foreign governments into complying with China's overall program of a rise to power based on the authoritarian one-party norms that inform the Chinese Communist Party's domestic rule. So we see that the Chinese Communist Party wants to expand its influence globally and establish alternative political institutions to the post-war international global order like WTO and the UN, and that the Chinese government is actively seeking to undermine the existing institutions so that the institutions that they're proposing under the rubric of what they call the common destiny of the community of humankind would replace the existing institutions that are dominated by liberal democratic norms. And part and parcel of this is their Belt and Road program, which is ultimately designed to reorient the global economy towards Beijing and China. So from that point of view, I've been quite active in trying to open the eyes of policymakers. But as I'm sure we'll get to later in the discussion, a lot of the key people who are involved in Canadian policy have become beholden to Chinese interests through various primarily financial incentives. And so there's a lot of kickback to those of us who try and raise awareness. But I would say, just in terms of a positive development, the past couple of days I've been involved in an open letter expressing concern about the issues with regard to the COVID-19 and pointing to systematic factors in the nature of the Chinese system that has led the Chinese government to politically motivated misinformation to the WHO and to Canada, which has affected our response because we relied on WHO information that turns out to have been false. And as a result of Chinese politically motivated misinformation, there have been a large number of unnecessary deaths, particularly of our elders here in Canada. So we put together this letter, and it's received considerable support. And within Canada, we've had strong support from distinguished figures like Irvin Cotler, who was our former Minister of Justice and Attorney General under a Liberal government. And we've received the signature to the letter of the leader of the official opposition, Andrew Scheer. The two main candidates for the Conservative leadership, Erin O'Toole and Peter MacKay, have signed on, and quite a number of other parliamentarians, including NDP member, that suggests that, you know, in our next government, it's quite likely that due to the reassessment of our international role once the COVID-19 crisis has passed, that some of the ideas that people like me and others have been articulating with regard to a better way to engage with China and the global community may in fact become government policy. I remain eternally hopeful that we can turn our China policy around and get it to serve Canadian interests and to stave off the spread of authoritarian politics that is forming a greater and greater threat to the liberal democratic norms that, you know, make politics just for ordinary people in countries that enjoy the benefit of the democratic system.
So you talk about these liberal democratic norms. I'm just curious, what do you think in concrete ways, in what concrete ways would Canada change if it continues in business as usual with the CCP?
Well, I think the Chinese government has a number of agendas for Canada. Unfortunately, Canada doesn't really have agendas for China in terms of a coherent China policy. But the Chinese government would like to acquire key Canadian energy and mineral resources. You know, there was a few years ago the Chinese offshore oil corporation, a state firm that successfully made a $15 billion bid for the Nexen company out of Calgary, a major Canadian energy supplier, or Canadian energy firm. And at that time, under the Harper government, the $15 billion sale went through, but Mr. Harper made a statement that except under exceptional circumstances in future, Chinese state firms could only acquire up to 49% of Canadian natural resources and not a controlling interest. But China's been opposing this, seeing it as discriminatory and prejudicial, even though certainly the Chinese government would not entertain any reciprocal measures, such as allowing Canadian firms to acquire a controlling interest in any Chinese natural resources. They protect their natural resource sector through their constitution, where it cites this as important to their national security. So the Chinese government would like to do much more investment in Canada. And after the decision came through, I've been quite active in, suggesting that it was a bad idea to allow the Chinese state to get control of Canadian natural resources, because once China attains a significant leverage over the Canadian economy, then they can start to impose a political leverage on us, such as insisting that we not protest against China's support for rogue regimes, China's expansion of territory into the South China Sea, China's domestic human rights abuses, including the cultural genocide against the Turkic Muslims, the Uyghurs, in the northwestern part of the People's Republic of China, and so on. So, if China got a lot of control over economy, then because they have an integrated nation state, they could then use that to further their other political interests globally and in Canada. Not to speak of, China not wanting Canada to engage in security measures against Chinese influence activities in our country and cyber espionage. And so we have that. And then we've also got this Huawei 5G question before us. And, for people like me and others, the idea of having the Chinese state with the capacity to control our telecommunications is very dangerous for Canada in terms of the knowledge that China could acquire of critical Canadian infrastructure through this venture, which, like giving them the potential to turn off the water and electricity.
Yeah.
And also because of the potential for targeted intelligence. The Chinese government has been very active in stealing personnel files from the government of the United States. I think they got something like 26 million confidential files, which is part and parcel of their desire to expand, I think, their social credit information controls beyond the borders of their country internationally. So we have these concerns that I think Canada has to stand firm on. There is a perception, particularly promoted by people who speak favorably of the Chinese regime in Canada, that if Canada does not comply with People's Republic of China regime demands, like if they don't allow China controlling stakes in our natural resources, that have a devastating impact on Canada's economic future, as China is the ascendant power and the United States is the declining power, and therefore we ought to, cart our horse to China's rise. And as some Canadian figures have put it, if you can't beat them, join them, and that we should make the necessary compromises in terms of our Canadian values to ensure the promotion of our economy. And, after I was quite active and arguably successful in playing a small part in influencing the Harper government decision to allow the CNOOC-Nexen deal to go through, but the future deals would not allow Chinese state controlling influence in Canadian natural resource and energy. In other words, welcome their investment, but up to 49%. I did get the call from the vice president of a major Canadian bank rather late in the evening. I believe he may have been dipping into the whiskey a bit, and he used a certain number of quite profane words to characterize myself, and said that as a result of my work, Canada had lost $200 billion worth of Chinese state investment. Well, I think that's true. Chinese state would be prepared to invest generously in Canada if we would let them, including development of infrastructure using Chinese labor to get oil sands oil to tide-water by putting in pipelines across sensitive areas, sensitive ecological areas, and loosening our restrictions on the ability of Chinese tankers to move in the complicated waters of the BC coast. We would get a lot. But in terms of the Chinese retaliation against the Canadian economy, I think there is a misimpression that a lot of Canada's external trade goes to the People's Republic of China. Maybe if you asked the average person that said how much of our external trade in goods and services go to China, people might sort of say, oh, I think about 30%, and the rest goes to the States. Well, the actual statistics are 78% goes to the United States. Until China imposed non-tariff barriers restricting the export of Canadian agricultural commodities into China, specifically the $3 billion a year sale of canola seeds, the proportion of our external trade to China was 4.7%, and is now down to closer to 4%.
Oh, not significant.
So 4% versus 78%. And, so up to now, our dependence on the Chinese economy that would suggest that we should compromise is not that great. My own feeling is that if we cannot get the Chinese regime to sincerely collaborate in the international rules-based order, not arbitrarily arrest Canadians like Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor when they're upset about other things, that we have to diversify our trade away from China, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership looks like a good place to go. And if it's impossible to do business with China without a compromise on our commitment to the rules-based international order, or to human rights, then we have to make a hard decision and realize that in our long-term interest as a middle power, Canada needs to have the institutions that allow middle powers to effectively join together to counter the hegemonism of greater powers. And so we'd want to be strengthening our alliance with like-minded democratic powers as a means to try and convince the Chinese regime that they should become cooperative in global institutions and engage in fair and reciprocal trade and abide by the norms of diplomacy and rule of law.
So could I just get you to expand on that a little bit? You mentioned that we should claw back our trade from China, and you mentioned some of the reasons that we should do that. What practical steps can Ottawa take? You mentioned collective action with other like-minded democratic countries. That seems like a practical step. I'm just not sure how in concrete terms that would work out. So could you just walk us through that?
Yes, I mean, it's not a question that we would claw back our trade. It's a question of we should be prepared for Chinese retaliation. So if Ottawa makes a decision that we're not going to allow the Huawei 5G to dominate our Tel and Belus networks, the Chinese may then decide to impose more non-tariff barriers in violation of their commitments to the WTO to try and punish Canada. But this kind of activity has been taking place not just with Canada, but with many other countries. Sweden has had a terrific amount of difficulty in getting their goods to market because of a conflict over the Chinese arbitrary kidnapping out of Thailand of a Swedish national, taking him to China and subjecting him to kangaroo trial, because this person was publishing materials about the Chinese leadership that the Chinese government found damaging to the prestige of the regime. We've got Korea, South Korea, that agreed to install an early warning site for detecting missiles out of North Korea heading towards North America on a golf course that was owned by the Lotte Corporation. China then imposed severe restrictions on the Lotte Corporation's operations in China, including closing a number of stores on false basis of fire code regulations, restricting Chinese tourism into South Korea, and many other measures that caused Lotte to basically have to withdraw. Every country of the world is suffering from a similar sort of issue. Japan has several cases comparable to Kovrik and Spaver. Australia has had the same sorts of experiences and restrictions on their major export of iron ore. So we've all got the same sorts of concerns, because the Chinese regime behavior has been working for China in a kind of divide and conquer, and using these arbitrary and false discourses to try and pressure governments to do what China wants. So, there are institutions that exist where middle powers could be getting together and coming up with some common standards for how we will engage with the People's Republic of China, so that the Chinese government cannot divide and conquer. This is something the Chinese government is very, very concerned about, because at present they can benefit from an asymmetrical power relationship with middle powers, but if there was an effective alliance, then this would be harder for them. Right now they have to treat the United States differently, because that's a genuine economic and power rival, that they can treat Canada in a highly arbitrary and unfair way. So we have seen, some getting together of middle powers on other issues, like we had a conference in Vancouver about North Korea. We had Canadian-led action to try and suppress the spread of landmines and small arms. I think my own feeling is that the TPP would be a good forum for this kind of activity, because it excludes China, as the Chinese economy is not eligible for membership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because it's not a free and open economy, and that this institution, like the APEC before it, could start to take on some political issues that would allow countries that are not in institutions that are not able to be manipulated by China, like the G20 or the UN. So, one hopes that there will be a general awareness of the importance of this, and that we'll see some action after the COVID-19 is over. We already see in Britain a strong movement to reverse the British government's proposal to allow Huawei access to what they call the periphery, as opposed to the core of their telecommunications system in Britain, to up to 35%. But I think for a lot of us, any Huawei involvement in telecommunications with 5G is dangerous. And it looks as if there will be sufficient pressure by the Conservative Party backbench that Boris Johnson may reverse that decision. So, I think that maybe the COVID-19 incident and China's dissembling and dishonesty and apparent manipulation of the WHO through co-opting key persons in that institution is tipping the balance in terms of Western awareness of the dangers of allowing us to engage in relations with the People's Republic of China on People's Republic of China terms, and not on the terms and values that inform the institutions that regulate global trade and diplomacy that China is trying so hard to undermine.
Now, you and I are both academics, and what you're saying is pretty unique among academics. I think a lot of academics in Canada, even those who study China, might be a little bit afraid to say what you're saying specifically. According to an August 2019 National Post story, David Vigneault, head of Canada's spy agency, CSIS, said that China is a clear and significant threat to Canada. He singled out universities in particular. How has the CCP penetrated into Canadian academia?
Well, I think that it's clear that Canadian universities have a very strong economic reliance on students from China. These are they pay the high international fee, and in some institutions in Canada, they really are a major part of the sustaining income, and including Brock, where we've got I think something in the order of 5 or 6% of our student body are self-paying students from the People's Republic of China. So, from that point of view, it becomes difficult for Canadian universities to do anything that could cause the Chinese regime to put, say, Brock University or another university on a blacklist and lose that very significant sustaining income. So I think the process is quite subtle. It's not, I mean, there is some direction. China has education officers in Toronto who come down here and engage with our university administrators, and I think send them signals that they certainly don't want, say, the Falun Gong to be engaging in any activities on campus, or representatives of the Dalai Lama who might want to talk about their perspective on China's governance of Tibet. That if the university agreed to any such activities, that would then, what they say, hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, and then cause the Chinese students to be directed to other universities. So that's one. The other concern is the Confucius Institutes, where universities, including Brock, receive funding directly from the government of China to engage in academic programming on campus, and that programming, is on Chinese terms with Chinese teachers sent out from China. So it does, I think, challenge the principles of academic freedom, in that one discourse about Chinese history will be taught, not the one that's generally accepted in the West, which would include the 1989 Tiananmen incident, or the 1961 Great Leap Forward famine, in which something in the order of 40 million people died due to government mismanagement of the Chinese economy, or other concerns about the China's lack of respect for the human rights, religious, language, and cultural rights of ethnic minorities living in the People's Right. None of that stuff would come up in the Confucius Institute curriculum. Their depiction of ethnic minorities would be a happy people who love to sing and dance, but would not talk about their great contributions to civilization, or the importance of religion, the great religious traditions to those people. So you do have that. And then another, actually more sort of disturbing finding that's been relayed by CSIS, but has come out of some very important work done by the Australian Security Policy Institute, is that there have been a number of scholarly exchanges in universities. McMaster was particularly named, whereby Chinese scholars are engaging in research on sensitive technical areas which relate to the needs of China's 5-year plan. And Canadian scholars are being given benefits, trips to China, and opportunities to share information, some of which might be considered classified. And it turns out that a lot of these scholars who are coming to Canadian institutions are coming under false pretenses. They characterize themselves as scholars in Chinese universities, but the research has subsequently indicated that they are members of intelligence agencies of the People's Liberation Army. So that the Canadian university has been misled about the background and intentions of the scholar who turns out to be a professional espionage agent as opposed to a colleague in bioengineering or whatever the subject area of the collaboration is. So that is a cause for concern, and it's very challenging for Canadian universities because we don't have the capacity to vet applicants for visiting scholarships and establish that someone is not who they say they are in a definitive manner. So I think we'll have to be looking at more of that, and the use of having Chinese citizens on campus in Confucius Institutes that may lead to the attempt to influence or coerce local Chinese communities or provide information that could be useful for recruitment of agents who would transfer classified technologies to the Chinese state, and this kind of stuff that seems to be going on. So, certainly China sees our universities as a place where they're able to obtain the information and influence that they need to serve their state interests. And then, of course, finally, the last concern is the Chinese Scholars and Students Associations, where the students from China are answering to the education officers at the consulates and embassies that their university is controlled in, that there is reporting done by the leaders of the Chinese Student Scholar Association on their fellow classmates in Canadian universities and on people like me who lecture on China-related matters. And as a result, some Chinese students are afraid to participate in seminar in social science courses, for example, for fear that their comments will be reported to the embassy and then will negatively impact on their files and future if they decide to return to China, or could even impact on their family in China if they started to express liberal democratic views and question the Chinese government's interpretations in classes in universities like Brock. So, that's a serious concern to us because academic freedom and freedom of expression by students is considered a center stone of the kind of education that we offer at institutions like Brock.
Yeah.
So certainly, if the students are being intimidated into not expressing their true views, that is something that we shouldn't be tolerating.
A lot of this is quite shocking. I'd like to turn to the issues of Canadian politics and journalism. I'm wondering if Beijing buys influence in either of those fields, in either politics or journalism. What I'm specifically getting after is bribes, bribes. Does Beijing buy influence through financial incentives in Canadian politics or in the media?
Yes, I mean, the Chinese Communist Party has what's called the United Front Work Department, and that is United Front Work it's an obligation of all party members, which would include all of the diplomats in Canada and other agents of the regime who don't have diplomatic protection. And we see in Canada that the People's Republic of China has many more diplomats accredited to our country than any other country, about a third more than the United States, which is very surprising considering how integrated Canada is with the United States. You'd think that the United States would have by far the most diplomats here. That's not the case. Anyway, so the question is, what are those diplomats doing? And we believe that a significant proportion of them are working on influence operations. And there may be some direct bribing that goes on. But what we're able to see is that some key Canadian policymakers, after they retire from the public service, which is not necessarily at 65, but they may leave politics earlier, have subsequently been given lucrative appointments to Chinese boards and Chinese business opportunities. So the question is, with a view to obtaining these lucrative opportunities once they're out of government, are these officials assisting the Chinese regime in challenging Canadian policies that might not be well regarded by the Chinese regime, or in fact providing information to the Chinese regime that's of use to them for intelligence and other purposes. So we don't have a smoking gun, a recording of, say, a Chinese ambassador speaking to a Canadian foreign minister and saying, if you don't talk about human rights and or free Meng Wanzhou, we'll take care of you later on. You can be sort of that. I think it's a more subtle process because one can see this phenomenon that if you don't, promote a hardline in government against China, after you retire, you get rewarded. In terms of academics, the New Zealand scholar Anne-Marie Brady has done some research on this and estimates that academics, including, I think, Canadian academics, who write reports which are favorable to the interests of the Chinese regime, can be appointed to different consultancies and boards and are earning an average of 150,000 US a year from these consultancies and boards. So if one was an academic who spoke out, who came up with academic results that were negative about China, then that you would no longer be given those kinds of financial benefits. So essentially what you're looking at is China is a poor country per capita, but the leadership of that country applies a huge amount of the national income. We estimate something like a third to what they call promotion of stability activities. And so these include externally the activities that are designed to ensure that persons of Chinese origin in Canada, particularly those who have family in China, will support the goals of the regime, and critical policymakers in our political process and people who are active in shaping public opinion should not bring out information that would be unfavorable to the Chinese regime. And I think that there is more and more work being done because, what I'm suggesting here is largely, it's speculation, innuendo, rumor based on that kind of thing. I mean, the fact that someone was favorable to China while in public office and then, is becoming quite wealthy in retirement, one doesn't have could be just a coincidental thing. But I think more and more work is being done trying to establish the operations of these Chinese agencies and to come up with some accountability. Australia is well ahead of Canada in this regard with their Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act, where they are requiring post-employment reporting of income from foreign sources for people who have worked in the Australian government. And this has resulted in a number of prominent Australian figures resigning from China-related generously funded boards, particularly the former Australian Minister of International Trade, Andrew Robb, who had negotiated the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement that those of us who know about these things do not regard as an agreement favorable to Australia, and had been involved in the 99-year lease on the entire port of Darwin, plus some programming of information between Darwin and the port of Burgeo. And he was found to be on a $880,000 a year private consultancy by the same billionaire that acquired the lease on the port. So there's no evidence of him having done anything illegal. But once the Australian Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act came into effect, he did resign from the $880,000 a year consultancy. So that's just one example in Australia. Our assumption is that there are similar things going on in Canada, but so far, they haven't come to light because the work just hasn't been done yet. But, sunshine is the best disinfectant. And I think we simply have to establish the parameters for appropriate behavior by foreign representatives of foreign powers in Canada, and establish the parameters for people who are in positions of the public trust in terms of their receiving benefits from foreign sources. So, it's something, it's a work in progress, but I believe that Canada will, over time, come to address these serious issues and do the right thing and ensure that our Canadian policymakers are acting exclusively in the interests of Canada and not having, subsidiary interest in promoting the interests of a foreign power in our country.
Now, turning from Canada specifically to more international concerns, recently, as you know, the United States suspended funding for the World Health Organization due to the scientific body's alleged mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, experts like Gordon G. Chang, which I had on my show, claim that the WHO, under Dr. Tedros' leadership, was doing China's bidding. If this is the case, then should Canada also, like the United States, withdraw its funding and its other support from the WHO?
Well, I think like most Canadians, including our former ambassadors, David Mulroney and Guy Saint-Jacques, I worked with Mr. Saint-Jacques in the Canadian Embassy an earlier time. We believe that, that there is a basis for Mr. Trump's concerns. And certainly there should be an investigation done of the leadership of the WHO who appear to be under the influence of a foreign power. And there are a lot of factors that suggest that this might be the case with regard to Ethiopia's relationship with China and the African Union. And China's putting in an African Union headquarters in Addis. So, there are a lot of things there. No evidence yet. I don't support, trying to burn the WHO to the ground by removing its funding, because we need, in this globalized international era, we need strong multilateral institutions to coordinate the response to health crises like Ebola, like MERS, like SARS, like COVID-19, much more than in 100 years ago when we had the Spanish flu epidemic, when there wasn't as much globalized travel and interaction. We need this. The problem, as Gordon has pointed out quite clearly, is that the Chinese government, for political reasons, has been distorting and hiding critical information about the nature of this disease. And the WHO has been uncritically accepting the Chinese discourse, particularly with regard to human transmission. When the SARS crisis was up in 2003 and China was not being forthcoming then, the WHO was much more aggressive in challenging China and seeking alternative sources of information. This time they haven't been. So with the human transmission, our own Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, accepted the WHO's assurances that there wasn't a established pattern of human-to-human transmission, and therefore Dr. Tam did not support the restriction of international travel from Canada into China. The result being that, we allowed a lot of people to come into Canada from China without checking their health adequately on arrival, or tracing them sufficiently for their contacts once they were here, or demanding that they self-isolate for 14 days, as we're doing now. So that then led to more spread into Canada than would have happened otherwise. And now we're doing all of those things, doing them well. But if we'd been doing them well weeks before, then some unnecessary Canadian deaths could have been prevented. So it's a very serious matter of China's, for political reasons, deceiving the global community on the one hand, and on the other, the WHO, not being proactive in challenging Chinese information, particularly when the WHO had urgings from other sources that the Chinese information was not accurate. And of course, in the case of our own country, Canada not having, we closed our public health office at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing in 2015. And that was an opportunity for us to be double checking information, ensuring that
Hmm.
the information we were getting about health concerns was valid. And we didn't have that source. And so the Canadian government becomes fully dependent, more or less, on the WHO. And turns out that that has led to considerable tragedy in our country that could have been averted. So, obviously, we need to do a strong investigation of this. And in general, the Chinese government's co opting and weakening of key UN agencies beyond the WHO is a cause for concern that I think the global community really has to get much more engaged with in the interests of maintaining the rules-based international order.
Now we're getting towards the end here. I'd just like to take it back for a minute and ask you personally, are you worried for your own safety, the safety of your family? Do you believe that the Chinese government is spying on you? And has there been any evidence that they have tried to intimidate you?
Yes, that has happened. I was detained by the Chinese Ministry of State Security in Shanghai in 2018, and I'm the constant target of cyber attacks and other approaches. This is Chinese government puts a lot of resources into this kind of work, and and people like me who are, I think the Chinese government overestimates the degree of my influence on Canadian policymaking, but in any event, I'm clearly a priority for them, and our friends at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service have been helpful in assisting in this regard, and other means to try and ensure that I can continue to do my work. I have been the subject of lawfare. I've been the subject of a lawsuit by the former Ontario Minister of International Trade, Michael Chan, who sued the Globe and Mail Inc., the Globe and Mail publisher, the Globe and Mail editor, a reporter, Craig Offman, and myself, with regard to articles in the Globe and Mail that suggested that CSIS had approached the government of Ontario about Mr. Chang, feeling that he had a close relationship with the government of China, specifically the Consul General. I wrote a piece in the Globe called "The Murky World of Chinese Influence," and then Mr. Chang issued a statement of claim about this particular piece. And many of the things that he said with reference to myself in the statement of claim are false. But so far, we haven't had an opportunity to go to court to test this. But I don't think the lawfare aspect has had a dampening effect on Canadian newspapers reporting on China. Obviously, this kind of thing does affect the Globe and Mail's liable insurance premiums, and that therefore one might think that the editors of the Globe and Mail might be reluctant to publish more articles that could be subject to these harassment lawsuits. But so far, we haven't seen that. And as you know, I continue to publish very regularly in the Globe and Mail and in National Post and the Ottawa Citizen and other newspapers. And we're seeing a lot of very strong reporting on China coming out of the Globe and of the Vancouver Star, the Toronto Star's Vancouver element. And in the National Post, there's several reporters who continue to do very good work about Canada-China relations. And so the attempts by the regime to intimidate or to use financial means to try and discourage people from writing in the Canadian public discourse, so far I don't think has been successful. But whether there'll be more, whether there'll be harsher measures taken, would the Chinese government issue misinformation campaigns about me personally, or make claims about me which are false to try and discredit me, sort of suggesting I smuggle drugs or and other moral failings or whatever, would that happen? It's hard to say. I mean, the thing is that, once the false allegation is made, the taint of it is never fully removed. And so there are some indications internationally among my colleagues who are doing similar work in other countries that there have been much more personal attacks. But so far, situation's in control, and I'm not inclined to be readily intimidated by, hostile authoritarian forces. I think people have to continue in our Canadian society to speak their minds out and to raise the alarm and to engage in fair debate based on reciprocity and honesty.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Burton. It was been a real pleasure, a real honor to have you on here. Where can we find you online? Do you have a Twitter? Do you have a blog? And I'll put that all in the
Yes.
description box below.
I think my Twitter is cburton001, and I do have a blog, Charles Burton, one word, blogspot.com. And I have two Facebook sites, one being my personal site and the other being my fan page, which are readily searched out for people who are interested in following my writings. And I must say, social media has been wonderful in terms of getting my ideas a lot of play throughout the world. And I also am heavily promoted by the Macdonald Laurier Institute that has a whole division, whole department that does this kind of work. So I'm pleased that I have so many followers around the world, and I really am grateful to the support and encouragement that I get from people that I've never met personally, but who I've got to know in cyberspace.
For sure. And thank you very much, Dr. Burton, and you stay safe amidst this COVID-19.
To you too. Take care, Christian.
Cheers. Bye.